Good afternoon. Welcome to this year's Saints and Sinners Festival. Today, I will be presenting the panel for Jewish lesbian literature and activism. And I am Michelle Carlsberg. Welcome. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself before we dive into this panel. I am a publicist, producer, publisher, event planner, literary executor, speaker, advocate, and author. I am one of the founders, publishers of Amethyst Press, and also the former publisher of Bywater Books. In 1989, I launched Lesbian and Gay Book Month with the Publishing Triangle. I've also been instrumental in planning conferences and festivals such as Outright, Saints and Sinners, and the Gay Games Cultural Festival. My words column appears monthly in the San Francisco Bay Times. I co-edited a Lambda Literary Award finalist, To Be Continued, and To Be Continued Take 2, Firebrand Books. My nonfiction piece, The Isle of Staten, appears in the book Love Christopher Street. I've helped launch both the Pat Parker Vito Russo Library and Staten Island Gay and Lesbian Center's library. I've won the Publishing Triangle Leadership Award, the 2017 Publishing Professional Award from Lambda Literary Foundation, the Community Health Action Advocacy Award. I am part of the Saints and Sinners Literary Hall of Fame, and I also took home the One Island, One Pride Award here in Staten Island. So again, welcome. If this is your first time, welcome to the Saints and Sinners Festival. If this is not, welcome back. We will be back in person to present next year in 2022, and we can't wait to see you there. So, Jewish activists have an important part of countless activist movements, from the global LGBTQ rights movement and civil rights movements to union organizing and women's liberation movements and beyond. Some of these activists have gone relatively unknown, and for some others, their Jewish identity has not been widely discussed as part of their story. In order to remedy this, here are three lesbian Jewish activists sharing their lifetime of activism and writing. I'm also honored to be asked to moderate. Although I have a father of Jewish descent, I was raised Catholic. But if you need me to identify as a Jewish lesbian activist, then consider my own personal movement as putting mayonnaise on my roast beef sandwich as we sat Shiva for my grandmother. But truly, the real activists are Judith Katz, Alana Dykewoman, and Irena Klepfisz. They will present the real Jewish lesbian, her stories. So please, let me introduce Alana Dykewoman, who will be our first presenter this afternoon. Alana is a longtime social activist, justice activist, editor, and teacher living in Oakland, California. She's published 8 award-winning books foregrounding lesbian heroism, including her Lambda winner, Beyond the Pale, and received the 2018 Lee Lynch Classic Award from Golden Crown for her first novel, Riverfinger Women. In 2018, she was also inducted into the Saints and Sinners Hall of Fame. From 1987 through 1994, she published the international lesbian feminist journal, Sinister Wisdom, for which she just co-edited a special issue on Jewish lesbians. Currently, she's working on a full-length play about her spouse's life and dementia, incorporating issues around the right to die in residency with the Alter Theater in San Rafael. She is grateful to all lesbian connections that have led her to a useful old age. Please welcome Alana Dykewoman.
Hello, and I believe it is afternoon when you are seeing this. Jewish lesbian writers is a Google category. There are, for instance, 37 Jewish lesbian fiction writers on a list at Goodreads, not all of whom are known for writing fiction. But these are some from the list: Eve Ensler, Leslie Feinberg, Marilyn Hacker, Lisa Cron, Fran Leibowitz, Paula Vogel, Karen Tolchinsky, Alice Black, Jill Feldman, Nancy Totter, Rima Shore, Adrienne Rich. Here are some more: Aurora Levins Morales, Achio Behas, Rachel Waba, Marcia Friedman, and of course, Judith Katz and Irena Klepfisz. And there will always be dozens I've missed, which is what happens when you start making definitive lists. Jewish lesbian writers. Gertrude Stein was the first Jewish lesbian writer in English that we know of. Her project, which is often thought to echo Cubism in language, now seems to me more a reflection of people who grow up in multilingual families, the children of immigrants and displaced peoples. But that's a subject for an academic paper. After Gertrude, who is not all that clear about anything, I wrote the next novel with lesbian characters named as Jews, Riverfinger Women, first published in 1974. It was not my intention at the time to write a Jewish novel. I was in my early 20s and more interested in sex, drugs, and poetry. While I was living in Oregon in 1979, I somehow found, or was found by, Evie Beck, editor of the first anthology of Jewish lesbians, Nice Jewish Girls, and contributed an essay, as did Irena. When that anthology came out, a group of Orthodox rabbis in New York excommunicated all contributors. Being disowned by your extended community is a Jewish, often a writer's, and definitely a lesbian experience. My mother was furious, but I had a moment of pure freedom. If I don't exist, I can do anything. The same year that Nice Jewish Girls came out at the first Jewish feminist conference in Oakland, someone, perhaps Jane Littwoman, asked me about identifying as Jewish, to which I replied, well, my parents are Jewish. I don't identify as anything. She laughed and said something I don't remember, but that changed my mind. Certainly, living on the coast of Oregon had something to do with looking at and claiming Jewish identity. The coast of Oregon was the only place I've ever lived where it was much scarier to be known as a Jew than a dyke. In many places in the US, it's relatively easy to disappear into being an ordinary white citizen with all the privileges of that identity if you are a white Ashkenazi Jew. I was going to say most places, but then I thought about Birmingham and New Orleans, Nashville, possibly Milwaukee or Bismarck, any small town where being a Jew might be easily identifiable, dangerous, or put into an outsider category. Might be gunned down while praying in Pittsburgh. When I went to Germany in 2000 to tour with the German edition of Beyond the Pale, I was a Jew 24 hours a day, a subject mostly of curiosity among the audiences. My direct ancestors weren't German, they were from Latvia and Hungary. But it becomes evident that our sensibilities as writers are bred in a petri dish of historical trauma, compounded by the current trauma of the state of Israel in all the ways we experience that. Jewish lesbians participated in the civil rights, anti-war, feminist, and lesbian movements, as well as the fat liberation and disability rights movements, far out of proportion to our statistical population percentage. We founded presses, Out and Out Books, Persephone Press, Firebrand. We edited literary journals. Sinister Wisdom has a long history of Jewish editors after its founders passed it on to Adrienne Rich and Michelle Cliff, who was African Caribbean. And we wrote books. One part of being a Jew is being bookish. We are said to be people of the book, which is taken to mean the Bible. But I like instead to think of the collected poems of Muriel Rukeyser as a foundation and spiritual text. Speaking of Muriel Rukeyser, when I hold something up as complex as being a Jewish lesbian writer in the 20th and 21st centuries, I often end up interlacing my ideas with stories. This is the last one for now. When I was 17 or 18, living with my first lover in Chicago, I went to an anti-war reading, anti-Vietnam War. Hundreds of people were there, and I was sitting high above the stage, which was populated by guys, Robert Creeley, Allen Ginsberg. At some point, they invited Muriel Rukeyser onto the stage, the only woman, and treated her like a visitor from another planet, which is what she seemed. Big, intensely focused, wrapped in her power like a cloak. Seeing her, hearing her read with passion and skill, suddenly made my own life possible to me. A fat Jewish queer poet could part the waters of the patriarchy and make herself heard. When we claim who we are, we make room for everyone else to claim that. Yes, on one level, we are all sand and sunset, one organism separated only by the illusory curtains of skin. But on another, the one we live in when we enter community, we are the manifestations of our ancestors who carried their stories and songs wherever they went. Jewish lesbian writers, writing the stories imprinted on us, the stories we read in each other's eyes, the stories that, by entering the world, change it. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Judith Katz. She is the author of 2 novels, Running Fiercely Towards a High Thin Sound, which won the Lambda Literary Award for Best Lesbian Fiction in 1992, and The Escape Artist, first published in 1996. Both books were originally published by Firebrand Books and recently reissued by Bywater Books. The Escape Artist has been recently published by Dot Books in Germany. Please welcome Judith Katz.
Hello. So interesting to have a virtual audience. It's really strange, so anyway. It's a little embarrassing to admit this now, but when I was a junior, when I was in junior high school and high school, it was my great desire to write like a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and not just any white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. I wanted to write just like one of the most patrician American writers I can think of, John Updike. To that end, my short story characters were frailish blonde boys with gender neutral names like Kit and Andy. They smoked sulkily. They wore army jackets a half size too big, and they longed for, you know, that unattainable girl. By the time I got to college in 1969, I had ditched Updike for a slightly more appropriate, at least queer role model. That was Carson McCullers. But the central characters that I wrote about were still male. They were still named Kit and Andy. I think one of them was named Kim. And as I recall, my creative writing teacher's only criticism for my first assignment was that I used the word gentle too much. My sophomore year, I switched genres and saw myself as a playwright. And while my dialogue was still lacking a kind of chewiness that I like to think I've incorporated into my work now, at least I was beginning to make women the center of my work, because what was going on around me was totally exciting and totally speaking to me, because a national culture of feminism and queerness was coalescing around me, complete with bookstores, restaurants. When I came out in 1971, I was still a student at the University of Massachusetts, but I was living right next to a town that was about to explode with the bookstore, the film co-op that Alana was pretty much essentially involved in, lesbian only space. lesbians all over were arguing and creating theory. They were creating publishing venues. They were making overtly political art, theater, music. And for this, my writing became all in. I really could find permission to write about lesbians and myself as a lesbian. But was it Jewish? It wasn't until I returned to Northampton after 5 years in exile at an experimental theater in Omaha, Nebraska, which is like a whole other talk, that I began to understand that I could and ought to be writing in a more authentic voice. I had been reading work by African-American writers like Zora Neale Hurston, Alice Walker. I was reading Maxine Hong Kingston, writers closer to my own age whose work was newly published, like Cherie Moraga, Gloria Anzaldúa. Adrienne Rich and Michelle Cliff, as Alana had mentioned, had moved to the Pioneer Valley and were editing Sinister Wisdom. I was reading work by Audre Lorde. I was inspired by Irena's work. And it was all making its way into my consciousness and again, giving me permission. And of course, at this time, I was also sharing a house and an apartment with Alana, who was had just published had just published her book Riverfinger Women, and that was like a whole amazing experience. It was kind of Alana's background as a poet, as a concrete artist. We had a piece of paper tacked to the wall that had a knife in it and said, "Take a shortcut." And I've never, ever, ever forgotten that. It's been, again, living with Alana was a lot of permission to kind of go there. But it wasn't until a friend suggested that I read the work of Jewish writers, most of them men, much of it in translation, that I began to get the whole picture. And by that, I mean the whole picture of what language and what kinds of stories I could tell. The language of these writers, even in translation, was thick and juicy. The emotions were extreme and dramatic. People didn't sulkily look away from problems or lovers. They fled, sometimes for the whole course of the novel. Magic happened. If it didn't happen in real life, it was happening in dreams. The stories were often full of painterly colors, untranslatable Yiddish words in italics or with footnotes. And somebody like Esther Bronner would write a word in Hebrew or Yiddish, and then there would be a comma and the translation, and the story would go on. So I love these novels, but I also hated them. Not Esther Bronner's, but these guys. I hated them for what they often said about women, and in one rare case about lesbians, or more often what they didn't say and how we weren't there. And so I took it upon myself to write against these stories or to fill in the blanks. I took advantage of the revival of klezmer music, and I'm thinking about the fiddler, Elisa Schwiegel's here. And I listened to that music, and I took in visits with my crazy Jewish family with my ears way more open even than they had been since I was growing up. I should point out here that it wasn't until I found myself in another self-imposed exile here in Minneapolis, which is a frosty place where there are Jews here. I'm married to one of them, though they are from a different tribe. And once I was here and living here for a couple of years, I was finally able to finish that first novel, Running Fiercely Toward a High Thin Sound. And what I was trying to do with Running Fiercely was to reappropriate Shalom Aleichem's calm stories and make a town full of Jewish dykes, just as he had made a town full of Chelmites who were the tagline for the Wise Men of Chelm, where all men are fools. And I didn't think all lesbians were fools, but I wanted them to be all Jewish lesbians. It was a way to mythologize, as Alechem had mythologized shtetl Jews, to mythologize Jewish lesbians in Northampton, which was Chelm. The escape artist was a way for me to write about an alternative to the Israeli colonization of Palestine, the movement to settle in the Argentine Pampas at the turn of the last century. But it was also a way for me to explore the history of Jewish gangsters and prostitution that was rarely discussed in polite Jewish company. When I went, I did a book reading tour for Brandeis a few years ago, and the main thing everybody said was, wait, I find it hard to believe that Jews would do that to other Jews. Wait. They did, and it was really good for me to sort of insert lesbians into that story. So this is how I see my work as a Jewish lesbian writer, to put us into a picture or a story where we were missing. But always we knew that we existed. We must have existed somehow. And to find a voice and a language to tell that story, and to dare to say what we have been asked to please don't mention it. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you. And our next panelist is Irena Klepfisz. Irena Klepfisz is a poet, Yiddish translator, teacher, and feminist lesbian activist who has focused her activism on challenging homophobia and promoting secular Jewish identity and women and peace in the Middle East, and her research on Eastern European/Yiddish women writers and intellectuals. Irena co-founded the feminist magazine Conditions and co-edited the Tribe of Dina, a Jewish women's anthology and a Jewish women's call for peace. For 10 years, she taught English and women's studies in the college program at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women, and recently ended 22 years of teaching Jewish women's studies at Barnard College. She was a recipient of an NEA Fellowship and NYFA grant in poetry, and was a finalist for Poetry Lambda Award. Most recently, she received the Dreaming in Yiddish Prize from the Adrienne Cooper Fund. The author of A Few Words in the Mother Tongue, poetry, and Dreams of an Insomniac, essays, she is preparing a manuscript for the bilingual collection of her poetry and prose to be issued next year by a Polish publishing house. Please welcome Irena Klepfisz.
Thank you. I haven't written out what I'm going to say, so I hope I'm counting on my brain to be coherent. Let me begin by just starting to say that I come from a very different place than both Ilana and Judith, where my beginnings are. And my beginnings are really very much rooted in the Jewish community, and in a community that fostered in me an incredibly strong sense of Jewish identity, an identity that I was very proud of, that I had literally no ambivalence about. And it was an identity that was rooted in Yiddish culture and socialism. And it was manifested through the political organization that the community I grew up with was active in before the war in Poland, the Jewish Labor Bund. And the Jewish Labor Bund was an all-encompassing organization that wasn't just interested in wages and shortening the work week. They were interested in schools, in theater and art, in cultural identity, and they were very, very anti-religious and anti-Zionist. So my secular identity was just totally there. And it was nothing that I questioned or doubted at all. What I didn't totally get initially was that we were really a very small minority of Jews. And when I first came to this country, I looked at American Jews as total phonies. What kind of a Jew goes to a synagogue? What kind of a Jew prays? What kind of a Jew goes home when the first star comes out at Friday night? I'd never heard of such things. And I thought, like we all do as children, that whatever you're brought up in is the whole world. And of course, it's a tiny, 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 tiny sliver of the whole community. That took a while for me to understand. And I'm going to shorten this. When I first started writing poetry, I was writing rooted in that identity. A lot of that writing had to do with my background, which was, I was born during the war in Poland. It had to do with the Holocaust. And in fact, I was at one point almost worried that the Holocaust was the only topic I could ever write about. I didn't have anything else to write about. Now, when I came out, it was a very strange process for me because suddenly I discovered that in fact, there were all kinds of other things I could write about, which I didn't really know before. In other words, I started having a life, and which I think I really almost didn't have before then, to some degree. I'm exaggerating, of course, but and the problem suddenly wasn't my Jewish identity, but my lesbian identity. And I was extremely disappointed in the community I grew up with to discover this homophobia, not just in that community. It was really no worse or better in that community than anywhere else in the Jewish community. And the issue of homophobia was very disturbing to me, Jewish homophobia. It was like a child just, I'm in my 30s at this point. I'm not a kid. And it was very disturbing for me to find this out. It was like a child discovering that the parent wasn't perfect. It was sort of that kind of aha moment. But it was a very important moment for me because first of all, my coming out was really parallel with my feminism, because I wasn't I was sort of a feminist, I think, vaguely, but I really didn't think of it as very concretely. And all of a sudden, I had this whole other thing to write about. My lesbianism, feminism, the world, I suddenly discovered. And one of the questions that happened at that point for me was not so much was I a lesbian writer, but was I a Jewish writer anymore? I mean, I didn't know how to put those two things together. I knew that they were together. I mean, I was working on conditions and I knew something about my life was merged, but I didn't really know how to deal with it. And Evie Beck tells the story that I was very rude to her, that when she called me to find out whether we didn't know each other, but she knew my work. I had published my first book of poetry. And she called me to contribute to Nice Jewish Girls, and apparently I was rather rude and gruff and hung up on her rather quickly, saying, everything I write is Jewish, everything I write is lesbian, I have nothing more to say. And she repeats that story. She loves to repeat that story and humiliate me. But I did have second thoughts, because if you know Nice Jewish Girls, I did contribute to it. And eventually I wrote the essay, Resisting and Surviving America, in which I talked a lot about that split. I looked at it the other day again, which was interesting to me. I wrote it in 81, 82, about how upset I was with Jewish homophobia. And that was an important part for me to sort of figure out what I could write about, what was Jewish, what was lesbian. And in fact, what I said to Evie became really true. Everything I do write I consider Jewish, and everything I write, I consider lesbian. Not necessarily defined by the content. The other thing that happened at that time for me, which had to do as much with my feminism as with my lesbianism, was my awareness that my background, as much as I loved it, the Yiddish culture that I came from totally obliterated women. And I was really shocked when I thought about the fact that I'd been to shulas, like 6 years of afternoon shulas, 4 years of weekend shul, of high school, Yiddish high school. I couldn't name a single woman writer, except for maybe Kadia Molodowski. And I was horrified. People that knew me kind of would come to me and they'd say, tell me about a Yiddish writer. I didn't know. And so in some ways, one of the things that happened at that point was that I started doing this research, but this was research about straight women. I mean, it was not about lesbians. Lesbians have been looking for lesbian Yiddish writers. It's a very difficult topic, obviously, because nobody was that open about it. But I think one of the things that happened with me, because I'm older, I hate to say it, I'm older than Judith and Ilana, was that even though I wasn't dealing necessarily with lesbian lesbian content, the fact is that I was openly out and working on Yiddish material, I think opened it up for other people to deal with Yiddish who are lesbians. So for example, people like Claire Kinberg, who really doesn't know Yiddish, put an enormous amount of effort when she was editing Bridges to include Yiddish content and writing by Yiddish women writers in Bridges. A lot of the important kind of researchers right now are in Yiddish are lesbians, out lesbians. So I made a list of Hinda Burstein, Faith Jones, Hannah Pollack, Miriam Chaya Siegel, who writes original lesbian songs and sings them. Oh, Hannah Pollack, Myra Minievsky. And so I think my activism was sort of by being open and active in that community and not necessarily addressing lesbian content, helped, I think, lesbians be incorporated into that community, and also helped, in fact, opening up the whole Yiddish studies field. So that it's frankly, it's really dominated by a lot of lesbians and some gay men, but mostly it's women, So I feel like that's one of the things I'm most proud of. It's not anything I can point to sort of physically because I have a physical connection, but I feel I did open it up in some way by my very presence and my refusing to be closeted, which was a very painful process for me. I mean, that was one of the big disappointments of my life. Of course, people change, and the fact that all of these other women can now function, lesbians, shows that things can change. They can also revert back, as we all know. We're living in a time of reversals. Hopefully that's stopped. But I think for me, that's been one of the most important aspects of my activism. I was active in other areas as a lesbian, and people who do, I just want to mention this quickly because I think my time is up. People who have worked for years on women and peace in Israel and here, that movement has been led by Jewish lesbians. I mean, for years, there was a meeting of women in Black, a kind of reunion after 30 years. You know, they started in 1988, 87, the first Intifada. You know, I mean, in 2017, they had a reunion, and I saw the photographs of them, the lesbians in Israel. And I think here also, that's been a very, very important aspect of that movement. It's not mentioned, I think, often enough, how Jewish lesbians have been involved in that struggle. So let me just, and I have like 50 more other things to say, but I'm going to stop. And I just want to say also one other thing, that I've taught a lot of Jewish women's studies, and Ilana and Judith have always been on the, on the syllabus. I can't think of the word. So it's been a kind of interesting interconnection. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you. I actually didn't think I was going to have a question, but I do. This is a wonderful panel with 3 powerful Jewish lesbians who have quite a her story. And I was wondering, and I know Judith and Ilana, you have a history and roommates and the whole 9 yards, but the 3 of you, is there a time that the 3 of you, all worlds collided at once and you kind of like, yeah, we're your Jewish lesbian activists and we're going to set some things straight. So was there ever that kind of relationship between the 3 of you that you, whether it was at a conference or just camping? I don't know, you know.
I'll just say, probably there's more between Ilana and Irena, because while I was putting together this talk for today, I was realizing there's whole periods where I'm not where either of them are. I'm either in Omaha or I'm here. No, so they can talk about that, because like, you know, I might have heard about the contact, or I might have heard about a fight, or I might, you know, but I wasn't part of like any kind of thing at that point.
Irene and I have a long history. Many years ago in Northampton, we had this was 1976 or 7. We had a space called Lesbian Gardens. And at the time it was a separatist space that in which we had a weekly or monthly coffee house where we invited writers or performers to come up to Northampton or to come down from Northampton from wherever they were, or local performers. And we invited the members of the press that Irena was working with then, the Out and Out Books Press, which was Irena, Ellie Bolkin, Joan Larkin, and Rima Shore. Is that correct, Irena?
Clausen.
What?
Jan Clausen.
Oh, and Jan Clausen, right.
Rima came with us, but she hadn't published, but Jan was the one who had published the book, one of the books.
Right.
Yeah.
But Jan Clausen didn't come up to Massachusetts with you.
Yes, she did.
She did. She was there. Okay. See, memory is faulty. That's why we have these
Yeah,
Zooms.
she and Ellie came, and Rima came with me, and Joan came by herself until she
All right.
picked up somebody.
So we had this wonderful gathering of Jewish lesbian writers, and one of the women, not Irena, brought with her a straight woman with whom I worked in the Women's Film Co-op, so I knew she was straight. And she was started taking photographs of all the lesbians there. And the other lesbians who were separatists were annoyed by this and curious about her. And I said, well, she's straight. And they said, well, we're going to ask her to leave. I said, no, I'll do it. So I did it as politely as I could. And the whole group of them walked out. And
There was a big fight first.
it was a big fight. Those were the days when we all
Screaming, a lot of screaming.
Oh God, I don't remember the screaming, but
I
fortunately,
remember the screaming because I was screaming.
But here's the thing, I heard about this fight. Okay, I wasn't even living there and I heard about this fight. So there's
Right.
really only 500 people.
right.
Well, you have to understand.
Who's writing this short story?
Well, you
I
have to
just-
understand that we drove from Brooklyn up to Northampton and did not do the reading. We turned around and left.
It's for those of you who don't know the distance. It's about a 4-hour drive. Yeah, it was. Oh God, it also broke my heart. And we were all sitting around lighting candles as if somebody had died. So that was the first time that I met Irena.
Well, there is definitely a lot of her story here, and I think I'll propose that panel for 2022 because we could pick up where we left off, and decades of activism. And so you might have had a screaming match back then and stood your ground, but we're all here together, and that's really what matters.
Oh, we became good friends over the years. I'm not neither of us can remember exactly when that turned around, but it definitely turned around. We had in 1982 at the first Jewish Feminist Conference in Oakland.
Yeah.
Irena and Melanie K. Kantrowitz were there selling copies of Nice Jewish Girls in order to be able to fly back home, as I recall. And we had a really nice exchange then. And after that, I'm not sure, but gradually over the years, we became very, very good friends and co-conspirators in a number of various projects.
Do you feel that there's a younger generation of close-knit lesbian Jewish activists now that are kind of 30 years from now, they'll be having a panel? Like, do you feel that sense of community happening now?
I'm old now. And because like for me, younger Jewish lesbians are 40. So and we have there are some younger writers that contributed to this issue of the special issue of Sinister Wisdom that Ilana and I edited. There it is. It's kind of shiny there, so I'll hold up mine. I'll hold them up together. But I don't know, because like I'm, you know, I don't know how, whether people are connecting around necessarily identifying as lesbians, identifying as queer, you know, I feel, and also I stopped functioning in the academy a couple of years ago. I was, and so I don't really know what's going on. Does any of you know what's going on?
Well,
Go ahead, Ilana.
okay. I know that on the West Coast, there are a number of Jewish lesbians in various places who may no longer call themselves lesbians, because it's not a term that people use so much anymore, but I've grown accustomed to that, and I just feel like language changes, but there are still the necessity, almost the cultural necessity of lesbians finding each other and making community, and of Jewish lesbians gathering together the same way that lesbians from other cultures, races, and ethnicities gather together to create a shared sense of their spiritual, literary, political histories. I think that's happening. I know, you know, like there are Jewish women who consider themselves priestesses who are in their 30s and early 40s, and they are developing communities around them, and they are spiritual as opposed to religious communities. But the idea of Jewish ritual permeates a lot of those communities. And, you know, like when we were putting together this issue of Sinister Wisdom, there's a group of lesbians, I'm not sure where they're located, or maybe they're national, who put out a Jewish calendar every year. They call it the Jewish Radical Calendar, I think. And I would guess, when I wrote to them and said, are any of you lesbians, would you like to contribute to our issue? They said, how did you guess? We're almost all lesbians. So it was pretty easy to guess from the content of their drawings and the things that they marked on their calendars as things to observe, like Emma Goldman's birthday and stuff. So I think that it happens as we find the need for it, and it will continue to go on. You know, when I was writing Beyond the Pale and doing the research for that, I found that although certainly they were not marked this way in the historical record, there were many Jewish lesbian communities, mostly in revolving around the labor movement and the settlement house movement. That there were many Jewish lesbians involved in that, and they knew each other as lesbians, and they socialized together as lesbians, and you can see the fights in their organizational letters, if you get a hold of them, that are just the same kinds of fights that we had in the 70s about, I mean, issues of political inclusion, and who we should include and who we should exclude, and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of them fueled by fights between lovers and ex-lovers. So I think this has been going on a very long time, and the names for it changes, but the need for it doesn't change. And that as long as there is a patriarchy, as long as there is a male-dominated state, these groups will continue to exist.
I'll just say that at the synagogue that I belong to here, now that you bring that up, Ilana, there's like a whole when we could gather in person, there's a whole section of the sanctuary where the activists are young, non-binary queers who they are the ones that are doing, I mean, they're the ones that are making me very hopeful that there's like a political move forward here that connects up very clearly with the Black Lives Matter movement here and other movements. And so, yeah, but they're they always showed up every Friday night. They were there, which shocking that I was there every Friday night.
Irena, did you have anything to say? And then we'll cut to maybe listening to some works that all of you have written.
I just want to say that I think one of the things that I've experienced is that the whole, even before COVID, the whole thing with online communities, I mean, or being in touch with people that are not living in the same city as you, and that you can be really close to. And it's a different kind of form of community, but it's also kind of isolating. I was very, very shocked. I had this idea at one point that I wanted to get in touch with lesbians who are doing Yiddish translation, and because Yiddish translation right now is booming and women's writing is booming. And I wanted to know, there's a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of lesbians. And I wrote to about, I don't know, I think it was about 9 people. I said, would you like to, who are not necessarily translators, but involved with Yiddish in some way? And this was like global. I mean, it included Australia, included Canada, East and West Coast. And I really thought I was just throwing out something and feeling very self-conscious, but I was sort of stunned at the enthusiasm of it, of the response, which I thought reflected a kind of sense of isolation, even though these people are in touch with each other, because it's a fairly small community and people try to help each other out with how do you translate this or what do you know about that. And I thought I was kind of really taken aback almost that women responded that strongly to such a suggestion, because I did feel it showed some kind of, that something was missing. And I don't know where it's going to go or if it's even going to go, but I thought I'd just relay that because I found it kind of surprising. I thought it was all passé, frankly, with the younger generation, but not so much.
No, and just one more thing is that the younger writers who we included in Sinister Wisdom were all just thrilled to be part of this collection. And you know, I think for some of them it was the idea of having a piece published, but also that they were just like right there, all in, wanting to be part of this. And I found that really encouraging and very pleasurable, actually.
Well, we also do want to thank Julie Enzer and Sinister Wisdom for sponsoring this panel. We're quite grateful. And if you haven't received your copy of the latest journal edited by Alana and Judith, please order your copy online at Sinister Wisdom and keep Sinister Wisdom around for a really, really, really long time to come. So I'd actually like to turn this over and maybe share some of your writings with our listeners, and maybe we can start with Alana.
I want to say about the issue first, the Sinister Wisdom issue. It got caught when it was mailed out. A lot of subscribers haven't got their copies yet. And it got caught in the Postmaster General's nightmare.
Mishigas.
His Mishigas. And it's stuck in the postal warehouses somewhere. And people are now gradually beginning to get them. But be patient, it will come to you. That's all.
Absolutely. I just received mine. So absolutely.
So I want to read 2 things from Beyond the Pale, one of which is a poem that was published separately in my collection, a number of my collections, but in the last one in What Can I Ask, which is a Sapphic classic from Sinister Wisdom and Midsummer's Night's Press. And the other is just a little sweeter section. So they'll be out of order. The first one is the trauma, and the first one is something sweet. The second one is something sweet. Anyway, here's the first one. This poem is about the Triangle Fire, in which 146 workers, almost entirely Jewish and Italian women, died within 18 minutes during the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. The high death rate was attributed to not following safety and fire regulations, including the company's policy of keeping the fire doors locked to prevent employees from sneaking out. Over 120,000 people marched in the funeral procession. When I wrote this was much more current, but it keeps happening. This tragedy reoccurred in 1993 in a toy factory outside of Bangkok. Fire, locked doors, jumping women, over 200 dead. And it will keep reoccurring until we can fix that, can take the labor movement seriously and reinvigorate it. A law of physics. Saturday, March 25th, 1911. One body falling alone is its own weight times distance. Two bodies falling alone are their own, but if they hold hands, their weight is multiplied. Here's a for instance. Two girls are on a ledge. The building is burning. There are nets below. The girls are young and, for the purpose of this example, thin and frightened. It is 8 stories to the ground. The net can hold 90, 120, 150 pounds times the distance, but holding hands, they become 11,000 pounds on impact. The net breaks. No one knows the price of comfort, how much they loved each other and expected by jumping, neither to live nor die, but fly, released from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. This other section, for which I have to look down at the book, but I will try to look at you as much as I can, takes place around 1904. The main protagonist of the book is a woman named Chava Meyer, whose parents both are killed in the Kishinev pogrom of 1903. And she emigrates to the United States with a family of her cousins. Her aunt and uncle take her in, and they're living on the Lower East Side in a tenement. And most of the book, we see it from her point of view, though not always. And this is her just before she becomes lovers with her cousin, Rose. But she's working as a cigar roller in a cigar factory. Oh, and the word shul, which is used throughout this, is the Jewish, Yiddish, Hebrew word for synagogue. Come to services with us, darling Aunt Bina said every Shabbos, yet I couldn't make myself get ready in time. Nobody pushed me. I knew I should be honoring my parents' memory, but I decided I had to honor them my own way, with my own thoughts. I could remember all the words of the service. I understood that going to shul wasn't just knowing the words, it was belonging among the Jews. That was how Mama used to put it. But how could you stop belonging to the Jews if you were one? Not every Jew went to shul in New York, or could. In the New World, we each had to carry around a little shul inside ourselves. Anyway, I was mad at God. I didn't understand how someone who made the Garden of Eden would also make pogroms. Thinking about God gave me an uncomfortable feeling in my stomach. If I'd gone to shul with Bina and Rose, maybe I'd have gotten sick. It was better that I stayed home. Besides, It was nice to have these hours on Saturday mornings. Most Saturdays, Isidore and Aaron had to work. Rose put on her fanciest waist. She had 2 for the week and 1 for Saturdays and holidays. And she and Aunt Bina would leave for shul. I only had 2 shirtwaists, but that wasn't why I didn't like to go. I could have had another if I wanted to, with more lace than Rose's even. Lying on top of the bed after breakfast with my clothes on was such a luxury. Even though my shirtwaist didn't have lace, I could follow the starched pleats going down my chest. I pretended my fingers were revolutionaries going out for a walk in the hills at the north end of Kishinev. Over the hill, under the grass, the fold of cloth, my fingers walked, coming to the marker where the forbidden pamphlets were hidden. With my eyes closed, I could remember how the wind rippled through the wildflowers on a sunny afternoon. Stroking the cloth was making me dreamy, and I opened a button. My fingers curled beneath the edge of my undershirt, and the green behind my eyes became dark, dark as the worn wood in the pews of shul. I touched my nipples. They wrinkled up into square knobs. These are the handles to the Ark of the Covenant, I heard myself murmuring. Then I worried if Mama would have thought I was being sacrilegious. Was it sacrilegious to touch yourself on Shabbos? Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'd love to hear from Judith.
All right. I'm being encouraged by, this is very different from what Ilana read. This is some work. I 5 years ago, I was just finishing up doing a kind of intense chemotherapy. And so then I wrote some stuff like that I'm just now discovering on my computer that I think is pretty good. And being encouraged by Michelle, who is in fact my publicist, I will read you some of this. And some of the characters, these characters have appeared in my first book, Running Fiercely Toward a High Thin Sound, but they are older now. So my father, Mel, the family rock, sage, and wit of our damaged brood, was beginning to melt from the inside. His self-educated brain turning to jello, plugging back into the wrong outlets, so that he was waking in the middle of the night and dressing to go to a work he had 20 years before retired from, marching into the bathroom and sitting on the stool, trousers up or down, asking about the time once, then again 5 minutes later, then 10 seconds after that. I bought him a clock with a huge face and hands, but that didn't help. Though he clearly recognized Electa and me, he called us by either no name at all or Max. He waved his arms around his face like a seated hula dancer, then asked again for the time. Well before my father's intellect began to dissolve, my parents had moved into the Rappaport Center for Assisted Living, an entity that they and other up-and-coming members of the Jewish community of Worcester had invested in, donated to, visited when their own aging parents, my grandmother Branya, for example, were cared for in the attached nursing home across the way. My parents, in fact, had a plaque on the wall of the nursing home, once known to every Worcester Jew above 30 as the home, now called the Rappaport Center for Jewish Health, commemorating the fact that they had donated an original sketch by Marc Chagall, discovered by my father in a flea market in Buenos Aires. Don't ask, my father gently held the delicate ink drawing up before us. Some ex-Nazi Jalab was too stupid to know what he was dealing with. I've had it looked over by the Providence guy at the art museum. It's real. He had the drawing framed, and a few years later, for no reason anyone understood, and without a word to my mother, my sister, or me, He gave it to the Rappaport. At the very end of his life, it hung in the corridor just outside his nursing home room. A brass label was nailed under it. Sketch, Marc Chagall, gift of Melvin and Faye Morningstar. I would have added and family, but I was just as surprised as anyone to see the beloved drawing, which hung for years in my parents' living room, moved to the public halls of the home. Your father says he found it, my mother said, from the minute it was unveiled, unwrapped, and in its new frame. But I was the one who noticed it stuck between two pieces of that cheap Argentine cardboard. And she likely had. Though my father had the eye, my mother had the practice of years and years ferreting through bargain bins in Filene's basement. She knows as well as anyone, better sometimes, when a treasure was a treasure.
Thank you very much. It's great. Keep on writing. And next, we'd like to hear from Irena.
I'm just going to read two poems. One relatively sort of new, and the other one quite old. The first one's called Grief, Brunswick Public Library, Maine. At the library, the woman with the broken English is broken, and so she wails, cracking the comforting silence. Everyone stops at the computers, along the orderly shelves, at the children's desk, where the paper mache animals seem to be drained of their colors, as if the sound had washed them in tears. She clutches a small girl and weeps, her arms tight around the child, while a librarian tries to calm her. It's an old story. Her husband left, simply left, for the West Coast, for Singapore, Canada, for a job just down the highway in Harpswell. Perhaps she has no home to go to. Perhaps she'll kill herself and the child. She wails. The librarians huddle and call the police, and the police call for an ambulance. I think about the child, her fear, the father gone, and soon the mother too, for who will risk her with this woman? Who will risk the mother's pounding heart, her terror, her realization that she is alone on this unfathomable continent in a library with so many atlases and answers, and not one to translate an abandoned woman awash in grief. And this is a super old one. Etliche Wörter auf Mamaloschen, a few words in the mother tongue. Lemushel, for example, die Kurve, the whore, a woman who acknowledges her passions. Die Yidina, the Jewish woman, ignorant, overbearing. Let's face it, every woman is one. Die Yenta, the gossip, the busybody who knows what's what and is never caught off guard. Die Lesbianke, the one with a roommate, though we never use the word. Das Weibel, the wife, or the little woman. In der Heim, at home, where she does everything to keep Yiddishkeit alive, Yiddishkeit, a way of being Jewish, always arguable. In Mark, where she buys die Kartoffel and challah, yes, potatoes and challah, die Kartoffel, the material counterpart of Yiddishkeit. Mit Sibyllus, with onions, that bring Tränen zu die Augen, tears to her eyes when she sees how little it all is, weniger and weniger, less and less. Die challah, braided wie ihr Haar vor der Chasana, like her hair before the wedding when she was a Zashain Mädel, such a pretty girl. Die lange schwarze Haar, the long black hair, die lange schwarze Haar. A woman dreams, ihr Alters der Welt, her place in this world, und sie hat Moira, and she is afraid, so afraid of the words kurva, Yidina, Yente, Lesbianka, Weibel. Sie Holland, she dreams, und sie hat Moira, and she is afraid, ihr Ort, die Welt, die Heim, der Mark, a Mädel Holland, a Kurve Holland, a Yidina Holland, a Jente Holland, a Lesbianke Holland, a Weibel Holland, die Kartoffel, die Challe, Jiddischkeit, sie Holland, die Haar, die lange schwarze Haar, sie Holland, sie Holland, sie Holland.
Thank you. Thank you. We are coming close to an end of our wonderful panel, but I just wanted to check with everyone to see if anyone had any closing remarks or anything else to add. We're good then. We're good.
Well,
Thanks,
I
Michelle.
do want to thank you.
Yeah,
Thank Michelle
thank
and
you.
Saints and Sinners and my co-panelists, Judith and Irena, for this opportunity and for creating community, all of us together. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So everyone out there listening to this wonderful panel, don't forget to pass the good word on so others can tune in. We definitely look forward to seeing you in person in 2022 in New Orleans for Saints and Sinners. I'd like to thank Paul Willis, Tracy Cunningham. I'd like to thank Judith, Alana, and Irena for being here today and for all that you do for our community. And all I can say is keep on keeping on. Thank you.
Bye.